Between 1976 and 1983, Argentina's military dictatorship made around 30,000 citizens disappear in an infamous campaign for suspected left-wing political opponents. People were seized by the authorities and never heard from again. Terror and torture flourished in the military's so-called detention centers. The horrific events unfolding in Argentina later became known as the Dirty War. Explaining Argentina's political development takes us all the way back to the outbreak of World War II. Argentina declared its neutrality, and it remained neutral even after the United States entered the conflict in 1941. Motives for this stance were largely economic. However, policies were only partly successful, and Argentina struggled to arm and equip its military, while other Latin American nations received generous Lend-Lease shipments from the United States. In the face of opposition from both pro-Allied and pro-Axis groups, then President Castillo was overthrown in June 1943. What followed were years of uncertainty and constant military coups. In 3 years between 1943 and 1946, the country was led by 3 different presidents, each coming from a military background. General Arturo Rawson was made president but resigned after 2 days when his anti-conservative stance and his advocacy of the United Nations won no military support. General Pedro Ramirez replaced Rawson as president. He maintained neutrality in the war, but faced increasing opposition from all political groups except the nationalist right-wing and fascist sympathizers. Ramirez was removed by a coup. The presidency was turned over to General Edelmiro Farrell, who led a military junta, but under threat of international sanctions, his regime prepared for a return to representative democracy. The search for a solution ended in the rise of Juan Peron to the office of president. He organized the Labour Party, which was resisted by all the old parties and by the major vested interest groups. His victory, though narrow, gave him control of both houses of Congress and all the provincial governorships. Peron's political strategy and tactics were authoritarian and personalistic, resulting in the development of a new national movement, Peronism. He politically purified the schools and courts, declared a state of internal war in order to expand his executive authority, redistributed revenues in favor of the workers, nationalized public services, and gave preferential treatment to urban and industrial areas over their rural counterparts. Peron was a charismatic figure who spoke to working people in a language that they could understand. Despite having huge popularity among the civilian population, Peron faced huge opposition from the military, which still held a major power in Argentina's society. For years, military has been in a sort of independent state, organizing coups and replacing presidents when they stopped fitting the army's agenda. This posed a huge threat to Peron, who tried to balance his position between right-leaning generals and left-leaning public organizations and groups. Nevertheless, Peron's strategy was not meant to be successful, and in 1955 he was overthrown by General Eduardo Lonardi and was exiled from the country. A new period of instability and military rule was unfolding in Argentina's struggling society. Lonardi recognized the strength of Peronism and sought a compromise, but he was displaced in November 1955 by another general, Pedro Eugenio Aramburu. Taking a fiercely anti-Peronist stance, he dissolved Peron's old party and placed the labor unions under state administration. Nevertheless, the Peronists continued their opposition from the underground and by wielding influence on the factions that were competing for power. With their support, another presidential change happened, and Arturo Frondizi rose to power in 1958. Frondizi was a radical leader who promised to readmit Peronists to political life in return for their support. President Frondizi focused on economic development and showed a keen interest in reviving the flow of foreign investment. He devalued the currency to favor exporters and foreign investors. However, this had adverse effects on the middle and lower classes, who were the base supporters of Peronists. Rapidly accelerating inflation increased the difficulties of industry, and Frondizi had to use the military to uphold his unpopular policies. All of this led to conflict between Frondizi and Peronists, who brought him to power. In March 1962, the Peronists withdrew support from Frondizi, dissolved Congress, and set up a government in the name of José María Guido. The military, which before remained united, was now split between 2 factions. Most of the Land Army and the Air Force formed Azules led by General Juan Carlos Onganía, a faction that sided with Peronists and was in favor of constitutional government. The other faction, called Colorados, consisted mainly of the Navy forces and sought a dictatorship that would deal strongly with the Peronists and extreme leftists. As a result of the short armed struggle, Azules prevailed, and Argentina's naval forces were humiliated and subject to a number of limitations. In the following years, 2 new presidents were brought to power. The newly elected in 1963 Arturo Illia could not find an understanding with powerful Peronists, which in the end organized a coup in June 1966 and brought to power General Juan Carlos Onganía, a former Azules leader and commander-in-chief of the army. The disagreements between military generals expanded even further and resulted in another 2 governmental overthrows. Onganía did not have influence in the army like he did before because of his continuous support of leftist Peronists, which in many cases undermined the armed forces. In June 1970, General Roberto Marcelo Livingston organized a coup and replaced Onganía. Livingston's rule was short and not successful, and already in March 1971 he was overthrown by General Alejandro Agustín Lanús, who promised to re-establish democratic elections by the end of 1973. In the end, he fulfilled his promise. During all this time, exiled Peron had supported the Peronist movement and their political development. New elections in 1973 presented a huge opportunity for him to come back and regain power. Even though the military government prevented Peron's own candidacy, they could not stop the electoral victory of the Peronist coalition, the Justicialist Liberation Front. The newly elected Peronist president, Héctor J. Campora, took office in May 1973. It was immediately clear that he was merely preparing the way for the return of Peron from exile. This further boosted the tension between the leftist coalition and right-wing opposition, which tried to prevent the return of Peron. At the final return of Peron in June, there was a pitched battle between right and left at Ezeiza International Airport. The Union leadership and José López Rega, an associate of Peron, launched a violent anti-leftist campaign through a death squad organization, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, also known as AAA, which had the discreet support of Peron himself. Even though Peron has officially supported Peronists and other communist-leaning groups, he himself did not share their ideology and only tried to use them as a source of regaining power. In July, President Campora resigned, and new elections were presided over by another interim president, Raúl Lastiri, who began a purge of leftist influences in the government. The elections were held in October 1973, and Peron was elected president with his third wife, Isabel Peron, as vice president. The official comeback to the government was complete. After taking office, Peron continued the campaign against his previous allies on the left. AAA squads began to crack down on political, student, and union leaders. Argentina was in a state of virtual civil war. Leftist communists kidnapped and publicly executed high-ranking political and military leaders, and attacked and bombed broadcasting stations and military posts. Extremists of the right, including police and military personnel, formed death squads and killed leftists. Increasingly close relations with the US military contributed to anti-communism. The United States trained Argentine army officers and provided anti-insurgency training in the fight against the internal enemy. The anti-communism of the Argentine officers was strengthened by their commitment to Roman Catholicism. While not all officers were devout, they saw themselves as defenders of the church, especially of Christian ideals. An intense anti-communism, representing a worldview, an ideology, and even a self-definition, developed among the Argentine military. The political instability, turmoil, and terrorism in Argentina greatly threatened the military's view of itself as a protector of the nation's traditions, well-being, and public order. The military came to see it as their primary role to protect the state from subversion by alien forces and ideas, preserve essential Argentine values, and maintain internal purity. The military attacked all who might possibly, even in the remotest way, be or become the enemy. In any case, Peron's second term in power, for which he waited nearly 18 years, was not meant to last. After only 1 year of governance, Peron died in July 1974 and left his wife a deeply compromised inheritance. Isabel Peron, being a vice president, was the first in line to take office. She became the world's first woman president. The government became even more oriented toward the right, and violence reached new heights. Despite the extreme right-leaning approach which was favored by the military, the generals still could not accept the woman being their leader. On March 24, 1976, military officers deposed the president and took over the government. A three-man military junta filled the presidency with General Jorge Rafael Videla taking the lead. The junta closed the National Congress, imposed censorship, banned trade unions, and brought state and municipal government under military control. Meanwhile, Videla initiated a campaign against suspected dissidents. Throughout the country, the regime set up hundreds of clandestine detention camps where thousands of people were jailed and persecuted. At the same time, Peronists, who called themselves the Montoneros after the betrayal of their leader, resisted by engaging in hit-and-run assaults, bombings, and attacks on political offices, broadcasting stations, and even military installations. They killed about 600 military officers, government officials, business executives, and even labor leaders. In turn, right-wing bands, including the army and police, were killing left-wing leaders. There was an increasing cycle of violence. The Alianza Anticommunista Argentina, formed in 1974, even murdered priests suspected of left-wing sympathies. This cycle of violence made ever greater violence seem necessary and acceptable. It contributed to the evolution of the military's ideology, its perception of extreme threat, and its extreme devaluation of all opponents. The result was the arrest, torture, and murder of real and supposed enemies, and even of persons who happened to be in a house from which a supposed subversive was kidnapped. One of the victims of torture, who wished to keep his identity anonymous, shared his experience. "I was arrested on the 15th of October, 1976 by an army unit which surrounded and raided my mother's house where I was living. I was tied up and blindfolded. Then I was suspended from a tree with my hands tied behind me and beaten from noon until evening. I could hear my mother's screams as she begged them not to kill me. At one stage, they filled a container with water, hung me up by the feet, and submerged me head first. Women were interrogated in the same manner. They were stripped naked, laid down on the bed, and the torture session would begin. With women, they would insert the wire in the vagina and then apply it to the breasts, which causes great pain." Upon taking power in 1976, the military junta led by Videla adopted the statute for the process of national reorganization. It issued communiques and enacted special laws further suspending basic rights and justifying subsequent actions. Following established precedent, it replaced many officials at the highest levels of the judiciary, for example, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, and the Provincial High Court. All members of the judiciary were suspended, and the new judges had to swear to uphold their loyalty to the military. Over the next few years, as disappearances progressed, changes in laws and court procedures weakened individual rights. The judicial process became almost inoperative as a means of appeal. The rule of military junta and disappearances continued for 6 more years. In April 1982, the military attacked and occupied Falklands, a small group of islands ruled by England but claimed by Argentina. In response, England sent a fleet, which defeated the Argentine army and retook the island. This brought down the military government and put an end to the killings. The new democratic government was elected, which proceeded to prosecute the perpetrators. General Videla, the leader of the military junta, was finally sent to prison only in 2008. In conclusion, the culture of the Argentine military and historical conditions gave rise to these mass killings. The lack of democratic values within a society and the lack of an effective judiciary system led to a constant battle for power between leaders with extreme ideologies. Both left-wing and right-wing parties had no plan to establish a free democratic society that would respect the law. Instead, they tended to use physical power to gain an advantage over the opposition, with the military being in the middle of it. Between 1943 and 1983, in just 40 years, Argentina had 23 different presidents, 16 of which were military generals. Many are still haunted by the events unfolding during those times. It is the job of modern Argentina leaders to make sure that such horror has no room in the modern development of the country.